In 3 of the most powerful European forts on the West African coast, people prayed to God above, while beneath their feet, thousands cried for mercy in darkness. Listen carefully, because this is not just history. This is architecture with intention. Stone, placed on stone, not only to defend an empire, but to conceal a contradiction so profound, it still echoes through time. Above ground, there was order. Whitewashed walls. Wooden pews aligned in perfect symmetry. Voices rising in hymns, disciplined, reverent, reaching toward heaven. The sound of Scripture, read aloud with conviction. The rhythm of prayer, steady, unwavering. Everything in its place. Everything visible. Everything righteous. But below that same ground, beneath those same feet, there was no light, no symmetry, no order, only darkness. Thick, unmoving air. Walls that absorbed sound and returned silence. Bodies pressed together, not in worship, but in confinement. Chains that did not just restrain movement, but erased identity. Time itself behaved differently there. Days did not pass. They blended, stretched, disappeared. And the cries. Some were loud at first. Desperate. Calling out for help, for water, for mercy. But over time, even those voices changed. They weakened. They faded. Until many of them were never heard again. And yet, just above, life continued. Sermons were preached. Blessings were given. Songs were sung. And no one could claim they did not know. Because the distance between the altar and the dungeon was not miles. It was meters. A ceiling. A floor. A deliberate separation, thin enough to hear, yet strong enough to ignore. So the question is no longer just what happened here. The question is how it was allowed to happen, in such close proximity to faith. How does a structure hold both devotion and suffering at the same time? How do footsteps walk toward prayer, while standing directly above captivity? And more importantly, who designed it this way? Because this was not an accident. It was not coincidence. It was calculated. Every corridor, every chamber, every stone, placed with purpose, to create a system where one reality existed above, and another was buried below. Hidden, but never separate. Connected by design. And to understand that design, we have to go inside. Inside 3 places that still stand today. 3 locations where this contradiction was not only visible, but built into their very foundation. Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, Osu Castle. Because what happened inside these walls was not random. It followed a pattern, a system, one that reveals far more than suffering alone. It reveals intent, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What would it do to your faith if your place of suffering stood beneath a place of worship? Hold that question, because what we are about to uncover is not just a story about buildings. It is a story about systems, about choices, about a world where belief and brutality were not separated, but layered, one directly on top of the other. Because these structures were never just forts. They were instruments, designed with precision, operated with consistency, and sustained by something far more complex than walls and weapons. They stood at the intersection of 3 forces that shaped entire continents: faith, trade, empire. And when those 3 forces align, they do not simply coexist. They reinforce each other. Inside Elmina Castle, the oldest of the 3, established in the late 15th century, trade was the official purpose. Gold, ivory, commodities that drew European powers to the West African coast. But over time, that trade shifted. Quietly at first, then completely. Human beings became the cargo. And the castle adapted. Not randomly, not gradually, but structurally. Rooms were repurposed. Passageways were controlled. Dungeons were expanded. Ventilation was limited, not by accident, but by design. Above it all, a chapel. A place where prayers were spoken regularly. Where scripture was read without interruption. Now move to Cape Coast Castle. Here, the scale intensified. The organization became sharper. This was no longer a transition. It was a system fully in motion. Ships arrived on schedule. Captives were processed, held, sorted, moved. Everything followed a pattern, a rhythm. And directly above the male dungeon, an Anglican church. Services held while the space below remained filled. Not occasionally, not rarely, but consistently. Which forces us to confront something deeper than contradiction. Awareness. Because the proximity makes ignorance impossible. The sounds would travel. The smell would rise. The heat, the air, the density of human confinement. It does not stay contained. So the question changes. Not, did they know? But, how did they continue? And then there is Osu Castle. Positioned differently. Closer to political authority. A seat of governance in later years. But built on the same foundation. The same duality. Upstairs, order, administration, decision-making. Downstairs, containment. Silence enforced. Movement restricted. And always, that vertical separation. Thin. Deliberate. Symbolic. Because this was more than architecture. It was hierarchy, turned into physical space. The higher you stood, the more power you held. The lower you were placed, the less human you were considered. And somewhere in between, a floor, a boundary, a line that allowed one group to worship, while another group endured. So when we talk about Christianity in this context, we are not just talking about belief. We are talking about its placement, its role within a system that extracted value from human lives. We are talking about how faith was positioned, not outside the system, but inside it, integrated, normalized, repeated, until it no longer felt like contradiction, until it felt ordinary. And that is where the real tension lies. Because if this was intentional, if these spaces were designed to function this way, then it forces us to reconsider everything. Was religion used to justify the system? Was it used to ease the conscience of those above? Or was it something even more complex? A structure that allowed both realities to exist, without collapsing into each other? And if so, what does that say about institutional silence? About the absence of interruption? Because history does record resistance. It records rebellion. It records voices that refuse to accept what was happening. But within these walls, within these specific spaces, there is another story. One of continuation, routine, a system that kept moving day after day, while two completely different human experiences existed, separated by nothing more than a ceiling. So imagine it again, not as an idea, but as a moment. You are below. There is no light, no clear sense of time, only the presence of others, pressed close, breathing the same air. And then, you hear it. Faint at first, then clearer. Voices, singing. Words spoken with calm assurance. Prayers, rising upward. And you realize, they are not for you. They are happening above you. In the same building. At the same time. And no one comes down. No one stops it. No one breaks the pattern. Now ask yourself, what does that do to your understanding of faith? What does it do to your sense of humanity? Because this is no longer just about the past. It is about how systems are built, how they are sustained, and how, sometimes, the most powerful contradictions are the ones that are engineered to exist side by side. And now, we arrive at the center of the mystery. 3 locations. 3 structures that still stand, not as ruins of a forgotten past, but as evidence. Immovable, unchanged in their foundation. Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, Osu Castle. At first glance, they appear like any coastal fortifications of their time. Thick walls, strategic positioning facing the Atlantic, built to secure trade routes, defend territory, project power. But when you step inside, When you move beyond the exterior, a pattern begins to emerge. Not hidden, not subtle, but embedded in the very structure. Above, there is a place of worship, a church, not an afterthought, not a temporary space, but a constructed, designated, sacred environment. And directly beneath it, a dungeon, not symbolic, not occasional, but functional, used, occupied, a place where human beings were held, in conditions designed to break them. The same building, the same time, separated only by height. So the mystery is not whether these two spaces existed. They did. The mystery is why they existed, exactly like this. Why build upward for prayer, and downward for confinement? Why align them vertically? Why create a reality where one group looks up to heaven, while another group cannot even see the sky? Was this architectural coincidence? Or was it intention, disguised as design? Because architecture speaks, not with words, but with decisions, placement, proximity, purpose. And here, the message is difficult to ignore. But it raises questions that refuse to stay quiet. Did the worshippers know what was below them? Not in theory, not in abstraction, but in real physical terms. Did they hear anything? Because sound travels through wood, through stone, through space that is too close to separate completely. Did the voices below ever reach the ears above? And if they did, what happened in that moment? Did the prayers grow louder to cover it? Did the sermons continue unchanged? Or did silence fall, even briefly? And what about those below? Were they aware of what was happening above them? Did they hear the singing, the structured rhythm of worship? Did those sounds bring hope, confusion, or something far more difficult to process? Because imagine hearing prayers directed toward a God, while your own suffering remains unanswered, just beneath that same place. Then there is the question of design itself. Why place a sacred space directly above suffering? Not beside it, not at a distance, but directly on top of it. What purpose does that serve? Control, justification, a psychological barrier that allows one reality to exist without confronting the other? Or something even more deliberate? A system where faith becomes part of the structure that sustains the environment? Because when you repeat something long enough, when you normalize proximity, when you walk the same path, stand in the same place, hear the same words, day after day, it begins to feel acceptable, expected, routine. And that may be the most unsettling question of all. Not how it was built, but how it was maintained, how it continued, without interruption, without collapse, without the system turning in on itself. 3 castles, 3 churches, 3 dungeons, 1 pattern. And patterns are rarely accidental. They are repeated because they work. Which brings us to the deeper layer of this investigation. Because everything we've seen so far, the structures, the proximity, the contradiction, that's only what remains visible. But visibility can be misleading. Because the true story is not just in what we can see. It's in what was intended, what was accepted, what was never challenged, and what was deliberately arranged to function exactly this way. But that's only the surface of the story. The first layer of the truth begins here. Elmina Castle. The year is 1482. A structure rises along the coast, commissioned by the Portuguese crown. At the time, its purpose is clear. Trade. Gold, primarily. A fortified hub designed to secure resources, protect interests, and establish presence. And for a while, that is exactly what it is. A trading post. A symbol of expansion. A foothold on the West African coast. But structures like this, they do not remain static. They evolve with the demands of power. And as the priorities of empire shift, so does the function of the castle. Gold becomes secondary. Human beings become the commodity. And Elmina transforms. Not visibly at first. The walls remain the same. The towers still face the sea. But inside, everything changes. Rooms that once stored goods begin to hold people. Spaces designed for movement become spaces of confinement. And beneath the castle, dungeons expand. Dark. Enclosed. Engineered to contain as many bodies as possible. Ventilation is minimal. Light is nearly absent. And the air, it thickens with every passing hour. Now look above. Because directly above those dungeons, a Catholic church, positioned not beside, not across, but directly above. And this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Above, there is light. Natural light, filtering through windows. Candles, steady and controlled. The interior is ordered, clean, defined. Voices rise in hymns. Measured, structured. The rhythm of ritual, predictable, familiar. Words spoken in Latin, echoing against stone walls that were built to carry sound upward. Everything about this space directs attention toward heaven. Now below, there is no rhythm, no structure, only density. Bodies pressed together, without space to move. The floor, not designed for comfort, but for containment. Waste accumulates. Heat intensifies. And time stretches into something unrecognizable. There are no windows, no markers, only endurance. And yet, the distance between these two realities is only a floor, a single layer of stone and wood. Which brings us to evidence. Because this is not interpretation. It is layout. The positioning of the church above the male dungeons is documented. The alignment is measurable. You can stand in the chapel and know exactly what lies beneath. And there are accounts, records from visitors, officials, observers of the time, descriptions of the conditions below. Overcrowding so severe that movement became impossible. Air so limited that breathing itself became labor. Periods of confinement that lasted weeks, sometimes longer, before individuals were moved through another passage, toward the sea, toward ships, toward a journey that would not return them. And through all of this, the space above remained active. Services continued. Rituals repeated. A system operating in parallel, without interruption. So we are forced to ask again, was this separation intentional? Because proximity like this does not happen by chance. It is chosen, engineered, maintained, and if it exists here, in one of the earliest and most influential of these structures, then another question begins to form. If this was happening in Elmina, was it repeated elsewhere? Because systems, especially effective ones, do not remain isolated. They spread. They replicate. They become standard. And that is where the investigation turns. Because Elmina holds a detail most people overlook. A detail that does not just reveal what happened here, but hints at something larger. A pattern that extends far beyond a single castle. The system behind the structure. Because what we've seen so far, the walls, the church, the dungeons, that is only the surface. Beneath it, there was a system. Organized, repeated, refined over time. And inside Elmina Castle, that system becomes visible, piece by piece. It begins with separation. Not random, not temporary, but enforced. Men were held in one section, women in another. Each group confined to spaces designed for maximum control. Movement was restricted. Interaction was limited. And identity slowly stripped away. Because separation is not just physical. It is psychological. It breaks continuity. It removes familiarity. It replaces connection with isolation. Then there are the holding cells. Low ceilings. Minimal airflow. Stone walls that absorb heat during the day and release it slowly into the night. The design is not accidental. It regulates bodies. weakens resistance, reduces the possibility of uprising. And as time passes, something else happens. The system begins to prepare people for transition. Not freedom, but movement. From confinement to departure. And that transition leads to one of the most defining features of the castle. A narrow passage, dimly lit, controlled at every point, leading to a single exit. What would later be called the door of no return. A threshold, not just physical, but final. Once crossed, there is no reversal. No return to the life before. No return to land. No return to identity as it once existed. And this is where the emotional weight intensifies. Because these were the last moments on African soil. For many, the last moments of anything familiar. Imagine it. After days, or weeks, in darkness, you are moved. Not told where. Not told why. Only guided through corridors that narrow as you move forward. The air changes. The sound of the ocean grows louder. Light appears, gradually, almost blinding after prolonged darkness. And then, the opening. That door. Beyond it, the unknown. Ships waiting. Water stretching beyond sight. And everything behind you, already gone. No explanation. No ceremony. Just movement. Forward. Always forward. Now hold that image. And bring your attention back above. Because directly above this entire process, the church remains. Unmoved. Unchanged. Services continue. Which leads us to a question that history does not answer directly. Who approved this? Who made the decision to place a space of worship above a system designed for human confinement and forced departure? Was it an architect, a governor, a religious authority, or was it something less visible, a shared understanding that required no written explanation? Because here is what we find. There are records of trade, detailed, meticulous, numbers, dates, cargo, routes. There are records of construction, materials, expansions, modifications. But when it comes to moral justification, to the reasoning behind this arrangement, the silence is striking. No clear documentation. No direct explanation. No written defense that says, "This is why." And that absence is not empty. It speaks. Because silence, in a system like this, is not always ignorance. Sometimes, it is acceptance. Unspoken. Unchallenged. Embedded so deeply that it no longer requires justification. And that brings us back to the contradiction. Was it ignored, or was it accepted? Because to ignore something suggests distance, a lack of awareness. But to accept it means seeing it, understanding it, and continuing anyway. So what happened here? Inside these walls, above and below, in a system that functioned with precision, day after day, without interruption, was this contradiction something people turned away from, or something they learned to live with? Because the answer to that question does not stay in the past. It follows us into how we understand power, into how systems are built, and into how, sometimes, the most difficult truths are the ones that no one writes down. If Elmina was an exception, Cape Coast should be different. It wasn't. Cape Coast Castle. By the time this structure rises to prominence, the system is no longer forming. It is established, refined, scaled. What began as experimentation has become routine. Cape Coast Castle passes through multiple European hands, eventually solidifying under British control. And with that control comes something critical: standardization. Processes become clearer. Movement becomes more organized. Records become more detailed. This is no longer a developing operation. It is a machine, running with precision. And like Elmina, the structure tells the story. Above, there is order. Administrative offices. Rooms where decisions are made, documented, enforced. Schedules are maintained. Ships are tracked. Numbers are recorded. Everything is accounted for. And within that same upper level, an Anglican church, positioned deliberately, integrated into the daily rhythm of the castle. Services held. Scripture read. A structured expression of faith, embedded within the system. Now below. Nothing about the space suggests order. Only control. Large underground chambers, designed to hold hundreds at a time. No personal space. No relief from the conditions. Air that grows heavier with each passing hour. And unlike Elmina, the scale here intensifies the reality. More people, more movement, more frequency, which means more overlap, more moments where the two worlds exist simultaneously. Above, voices rise in organized worship. Below, bodies endure in enforced stillness. And the distance between them remains the same. A ceiling, a floor, a boundary that separates, but does not disconnect. Because again, we turn to evidence. The architectural continuity is clear. The placement of the church above the dungeons is not unique to one location. It is repeated, which removes the possibility of coincidence. Design choices, repeated across different sites, under different administrations, point to something larger. A shared model, a blueprint, and the historical records confirm the function of this place. Logs of ships arriving and departing. Accounts of captives held within the castle walls. Documentation of the volume, the movement, the duration of confinement. Everything tracked. Everything recorded. Except the contradiction itself. There is no detailed explanation for why these two spaces coexist in this way. No written moment of reckoning. No recorded disruption that forces the system to pause. Instead, it continues, which brings us to a critical shift in this investigation. Because once something appears once, it can be questioned. But when it appears again, in another location, under a different authority, with the same structural logic, it becomes a pattern. And patterns reveal intent. Not individual intent alone, but institutional intent. A way of building that carries meaning. A way of organizing space that reflects a way of thinking. So now the question deepens. This is no longer about one castle. It is about a system replicated across locations. A model that integrates faith, administration, and confinement into a single structure. And if that model exists here, then where else does it appear? How far does it extend? And who ensured that it remained consistent? Because at this point, the contradiction is no longer isolated. It is multiplied, reinforced, normalized across distance. And that is when a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. The turning point. Everything we have seen so far. The layout of Elmina Castle. The structure of Cape Coast Castle. The repetition, the alignment, the vertical separation between worship and confinement. It leads to a conclusion that is difficult to avoid. This was not accidental architecture. It was a repeated design, across multiple forts. Pause there, because that changes everything. Up until now, it could be framed as contradiction. An uncomfortable overlap. A tension between two realities that happen to exist in the same place. But repetition removes that possibility. Repetition introduces intention. When the same spatial relationship appears again and again, under different powers, in different locations, with the same outcome, it is no longer coincidence. It is structure. And that structure reveals something deeper than physical design. It reveals a system where three forces were not separated, but integrated. Religion, trade, control, not operating independently, but reinforcing one another. Trade required volume. Control ensured compliance. And religion occupied the space above it all. Visible, structured, constant, which forces a shift in perspective. Because this is no longer about isolated moments of contradiction. It is about a model, a way of organizing reality, so that two opposing conditions could exist, without collapsing into conflict. Above, meaning, order, moral language. Below, extraction, confinement, silence. And the distance between them, carefully maintained. Close enough to function together, but separated enough to avoid confrontation. That is not an accident. That is design. And once you see it as design, the question changes. It becomes sharper, more direct, more difficult to ignore. Was religion being used to justify the system, to provide language that explained it, defended it, made it acceptable? Or was it doing something else, something quieter, but just as powerful? Was it being used to normalize the system, to make it feel routine, expected, part of the natural order of things? Because justification requires argument. It requires explanation. But normalization requires repetition, presence, consistency, a structure that does not need to explain itself, because it is always there, always above, always continuing, so that over time, the contradiction no longer feels like contradiction. It feels like reality. And if that is true, then what we are looking at is not just a historical arrangement of space. It is a psychological system, one that allowed individuals to participate in one reality, while remaining distant from another, even when both existed within the same walls. And that realization, it shifts everything, because it means the most powerful part of the system was not just what happened below. It was how what happened above made it possible for the system to continue, without interruption, without collapse, without being forced to confront itself. And once that understanding takes hold, there is no returning to the surface of the story. Because now, we are no longer asking what happened. We are asking how it was sustained, and who allowed it to remain this way. By now, the pattern is visible. Elmina revealed it. Cape Coast confirmed it. But patterns become undeniable when they persist under different conditions, different rulers, different administrations, different expressions of faith. And that brings us here, Osu Castle, positioned along the coast, but distinct in its history, controlled at different times by European powers, later becoming a seat of governance, a place where authority was not just exercised, but centralized. Decisions made here carried weight far beyond its walls. And yet, when we examine its structure, we see something familiar, something we have already encountered. Above, a place of worship, a Presbyterian church, different denomination, different doctrine, different style of worship, but the same placement, the same elevation, the same physical relationship to what lies beneath. Because below, the dungeons remain, spaces of confinement, control, silence. And once again, the separation is vertical, not distant, not hidden in another structure, but directly underneath. So now, the pattern sharpens, because this is no longer about a single empire, not a single group, not a single interpretation of faith. We now have multiple denominations: Catholic at Elmina, Anglican at Cape Coast, Presbyterian here at OSU. Different expressions of Christianity, all positioned the same way, all placed above the same kind of space, which removes another layer of uncertainty. This was not tied to one doctrine, not limited to one leadership structure. It transcended those differences. And what remains is the design itself, repeated, maintained, carried across time. And that continuity becomes the emotional weight of this moment. Because generations changed, control shifted, flags were raised and lowered, but the structure, the relationship between above and below, remained unaltered, which means this was not a temporary contradiction, not a short-lived overlap. It was sustained, preserved, even as everything else evolved. So imagine standing there. In a place like this, knowing what came before, knowing what existed in Elmina, what continued in Cape Coast, and now, what appears again here. The same alignment, the same separation, the same coexistence, and you begin to understand. This was never isolated. It was never incidental. It was intentional, enough to survive change. Which brings us to a single line that now carries the weight of everything we've uncovered. 3 castles, 3 churches, 1 repeating reality. And once you see that reality, you can no longer reduce it to coincidence. You have to confront it as a system. Up to this point, we have examined structure, walls, layouts, patterns repeated across Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, and Osu Castle. But structure does not suffer. People do. So now, the focus shifts away from design and into experience. What was it like inside those spaces? Not in theory, not in records alone, but in lived moments, stretched across days that had no clear beginning and no certain end. Below ground, the conditions were unrelenting. Overcrowding meant there was no personal space. Bodies pressed together, not by choice, but by force. Standing, sitting, lying down, all became the same position. Because movement was limited. Air did not circulate freely. Each breath carried the weight of the room itself. Heat built gradually, then stayed, trapped within stone walls that held it in place. Light was almost non-existent. Time became difficult to measure. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only a continuous stretch of darkness, broken only when a door opened, briefly, and then closed again. And in that environment, waiting became everything. Waiting without information. Waiting without certainty. Waiting without knowing if the next moment would bring movement or more stillness. Days could pass, or weeks, and the mind begins to change in that kind of space. Because when you remove light, remove time, remove control, you begin to alter perception itself. Hope becomes unstable. Memory becomes distant. The present moment stretches into something that feels endless. And then there is sound. Not constant, but present. Shifting. Unpredictable. Footsteps above. Movement across floors. Voices carried faintly through structure. And sometimes, something clearer. Singing. Rhythmic. Organized. Voices rising together in a way that suggests purpose, direction, worship, from above. Because while all of this unfolds below, life continues above. Inside the churches of these castles, services are held. Words are spoken with clarity. Prayers are offered. Songs are sung in unison. A completely different reality, existing at the same time, in the same structure. And that juxtaposition is where the emotional weight reaches its peak. Because this is not distance. This is proximity. Close enough to hear. Close enough to sense. Close enough to know something else is happening, just beyond reach. So imagine it again. Not as history, but as a moment you are inside. You are below. There is no light. No clear sense of time. Only the presence of others, sharing the same confined space. And then, you hear it. A voice. Then more voices. Rising together. Not in distress, but in harmony. Words spoken with intention. And you realize, there is a gathering above you. A place where people stand freely. Where they speak openly. Where they direct their voices upward, toward something they believe is listening. And you remain below. Unseen. Unheard. And separated. Not by distance, but by design. Now shift perspective. Imagine you are above, inside the church, standing among others, listening to the reading of Scripture, hearing the echo of your own voice as it joins in song. And beneath your feet, something else exists, not abstract, not distant, but present, contained. And the question begins to press forward, more forcefully than before. Do you hear anything? Do you notice it? And if you do, what do you do with that awareness? Because this is where the investigation moves beyond structure, beyond pattern, and into human choice. Do you think those above knew? Or did they choose not to know? By now, the pattern is undeniable. Above, faith, ritual, structure. Below, confinement, suffering, silence. But knowing the pattern is not the same as understanding it. And this is where the tension escalates. Because what we are confronting is not simply architecture. It is moral responsibility. Who bears it? The builders? The administrators? The religious authorities? The system itself? History offers no straightforward answer. Religious institutions appear at the center of this contradiction. Chapel above dungeons. Faith operating in proximity to human exploitation. Yet when we search the records for reflection, critique, or moral justification, there is only silence. No speeches condemning the design. No written remorse. No questioning of coexistence. And that silence, it forces us to consider competing interpretations. First, ignorance. Could those above have truly not known what was happening below? Distance is small. Sound travels. Smell travels. Light is minimal, but awareness, likely present. Yet some historians argue, perhaps this was seen as peripheral to the main purpose of worship. Second, compartmentalization. A mental separation between faith and function. Prayers are sacred, and trade or control is mundane. The space above is holy, the space below, ordinary. A cognitive strategy to manage moral conflict, repeated daily, normalized over time. Third, justification. Religion as rationalization. Faith as a tool to make the system acceptable. The hymns, the sermons, the sacred rituals, perhaps they were intended, consciously or unconsciously, to sanction the operation below. To transform exploitation into something that could be endured by those above without immediate guilt. Each interpretation carries weight, yet none fully resolves the tension. We can argue, theorize, and reconstruct, but the silence of the records leaves gaps that demand attention. And that brings us to the critical question. The one question history still struggles to answer. Did those above see and consciously accept? Or did the system function in such a way that awareness and action were separated, until morality itself became secondary to order? Because the more we examine these forts, the more it becomes clear. This is not just about what was built. It is about what was allowed. And what was allowed persists in memory, in architecture, and in conscience. But the answer remains elusive. And that uncertainty is where the story deepens. After decades, centuries, of study, observation, and reflection, one fact becomes unavoidable. The architectural pattern is undeniable. Elmina, Cape Coast, OSU. Different times, different powers, different denominations. And yet the same design persists. Churches directly above dungeons. Faith literally layered over suffering. A deliberate coexistence of worship and exploitation. These castles were not just centers of trade or defense. They were centers of control. Centers where religion and commerce were entwined. Centers where human lives were confined, counted, and moved through a system that relied on both structure and silence to operate efficiently. And that reality forces us to confront implications that reach far beyond the walls themselves. We are compelled to re-examine colonial systems, not as abstract powers, but as operating structures that were deeply intertwined with belief. Religious institutions, once assumed to exist apart from the machinery of oppression, now appear integral to it. And historical narratives, long presented in sanitized forms, must be reconsidered in light of this deliberate design. Yet even with this clarity, the story resists closure. We can see the patterns. We can trace the design. We can acknowledge the suffering. But one question lingers, stubbornly. Can a place be both sacred and complicit? A question without an easy answer. A question that refuses to fade. A question that follows us from the stone floors of the dungeons, to the vaulted ceilings of the churches, and into our own understanding of history, faith, and morality. Because the truth, the full truth, may never be fully resolved. And that is what makes it both haunting and necessary to confront. Today, these castles stand as monuments. Stone walls, towers, and chambers, surviving centuries of wind, water, and human memory. But they are not just relics of the past. They are questions carved in stone. Questions that rise from the dungeons below and echo in the spaces above. What do you think this history reveals about power, faith, and silence? About systems that endure because they are normalized, about choices made above while suffering persisted below, about the coexistence of devotion and exploitation? As you reflect, remember this: the story is not only in the records we study or the walls we walk through. It is in the intentional design, the repeated patterns, and the human experiences that these structures preserved across time, across rulers, across faiths. Because sometimes, the truth isn't hidden. It was built in plain sight.